I believe what's happening on the streets of China this week is the most important story in the world. Brave Chinese freedom fighters are literally risking their lives to stand up against the evil zero-COVID policy that President Xi has used to blight their lives and gain close to total control over the citizens for nearly 3 horrendous years. Here's the thing, zero-COVID is about removing all freedoms, putting the state in control with digital surveillance, social credit schemes and draconian censorship all enforced in the name of containing an impossible-to-control airborne virus with a 99.8% plus survival rate. I repeat, this has long been nothing to do with COVID, but is everything to do with control. And that's why I believe it's very important that we never forget the British politicians and British public health extremists who wanted the UK to follow such a sick and dangerous policy. First up, and actually most chilling from a policy perspective, Chairman Jeremy Hunt, our highly unpopular Chancellor inflicted on the country in an anti-democratic and globalist coup. Perhaps it's no wonder, given his fervour to enforce Chinese policies on this country, which he admitted while speaking to the equally terrifying lockdown fanatics Independent Sage during the pandemic.
I very much agree with the central point in Gabriel's paper that we should be aiming for zero infection and elimination of the disease, because that is basically the approach taken in countries which have a SARS strategy as opposed to a flu strategy. My sister lives in Beijing, and she flew back to Beijing in the middle of lockdown. And just to give you an idea of the contrast, she was escorted from the airport in Beijing to her home by Ministry of Health officials. She had a police car sitting outside her house periodically. And I'm not saying we go that far in this country, but I just think it's an indication of how serious they are in the countries that have had to deal with SARS about stopping at the root every possible source of infection.
Just terrifying. The then Health Minister, Nadine Dorries, confirmed to me later that Chairman Hunt lobbied the government to follow a zero-COVID policy, which would have involved the British public being forcibly removed from their homes and locked up if they tested positive for COVID.
Jeremy contacted me as a health minister and said, you've got to speak to Matt. It was at the time the Nightingale hospitals were being built. You've got to tell him that you
Matt Hancock.
Yeah, you don't put sick people in the hospitals. You follow a zero COVID policy. My wife's family have experience of this. When someone tests positive, you take them from their home and you take them to an isolation centre and you leave them there in the isolation centre. That's the only way you can beat COVID. And I said, Jeremy, the British public will not stand for mothers and fathers and families and children being removed from their family and their home and put in isolation. And he says, who said they won't? And I said, well, the Behaviour and Insights team, who I've discussed this with, they won't wear it. And he said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Show me the evidence for that, because I don't believe it. That's the way we have to deal with this, is a zero COVID policy. Now, we would still probably be in some sort of lockdown if Jeremy Hunt had been made Prime Minister.
Look at China today.
Instead of Boris Johnson.
She's right, of course, because that's the issue with zero COVID. It also means zero immunity. So the hellscape of constant lockdowns continues in perpetuity, as we have seen in China. So while Hunt is the most concerning because of the powerful position he now holds, he is by no means the only British politician whose embrace of zero COVID is on the record. So in February 2021, this is over 1 year into the pandemic, with all lockdowns by that point should have been long gone. At that point, a group of 47 MPs backed an early day motion demanding that Boris Johnson urgently, quote, adapt a zero COVID plan that seeks the maximum suppression of the virus. So I'm going to show you now that full list of shame, which includes the likes of Labour's Diane Abbott, Richard Bergen, Bal Ribeiro Addy, Claudia Webb, Nadia Whittome, John McDonnell and Dawn Butler. The Lib Dems, Tim Farron and Layla Moran. The Green Party's Caroline Lucas. But most disturbing, actually, was the number of SNP MPs who backed the zero-COVID policy, including its Westminster leader, Ian Blackford. No doubt they were inspired by the truly mad zero-COVID zealot Devi Schroeder, a regular face on the BBC, ITV and Sly News, who was one of Scheming Sturgeon's main advisers during the pandemic.
I think what I would have liked to see is a four-nation agreement on an elimination strategy. The anti-lockdowners are reducing compliance. And when compliance goes and your numbers go up, we are forced into a lockdown. What do we need to do together to get there? And a zero COVID strategy is the best way, in my view, having looked at this for 10 months.
The best way. She still thinks, by the way, that China should maintain its zero COVID policy. That is a madwoman. That is a complete madwoman. I also understand some of you want me to stop talking about COVID and lockdowns. It was such a nightmare, so we just must move on. But the economic calamity we are now facing is almost all down to lockdowns. It is the cost of lockdown crisis. The politicians just don't want to admit they got it wrong. And China must serve as a reminder to how authoritarian policies that control the population never work in the end. So shame on Jeremy Hunt and all of the UK politicians who backed such measures. I repeat, we will not forget.